Kia ora Aotearoa and welcome to Wātea Fifth Estate, New Zealand's only multi-platform current affairs program, streaming live on wāteanews.com, the dailyblog.nz and broadcasting live on Face TV, Sky Channel 83. This is where we wrap the most important news events with the best political panel on television. Tonight, we're discussing the rise of industrial action in New Zealand, the argument for stronger unions, and which political parties are generating policy that can give muscle back to workers. With us in studio, Mike Treen, the National Director of Unite Union, and the legendary CTU Maori Vice President Sid Keepa. And on Skype tonight, we have the National Secretary of the PSA, Erin Polaczuk. Thank you, panel, for joining us. After a farcical health and safety reform bill last year that put worm farming in a more dangerous work category than dairy farming, the government have faced a spike in industrial actions and legal employment cases. With a U-turn on 0 hours, how do unions seize the advantage and push for better worker rights? Mike, Unite fought hard and long to end 0-hour contracts. How much of a victory is the U-turn?
Oh, it's gigantic. When the government promised to change the law in the wake of our campaign early last year in the fast food industry to end 0-hour contracts there, I was very sceptical. And then because of a generally pro-business, not particularly sympathetic to the union government, that's their record. But they were adamant that they were going to end 0-hour contracts, so I thought we've got to fight to hold them to account on that issue, and other parties did that as well. But the draft law they came back with was awful. It essentially legalised 0-hour contracts and with minimal compensation. And luckily they failed to get the support of their support parties for that draft law, so they had to go back to the drawing board on the issue, and in the end, with the help of the Labour Party, the Green Party, the Maori Party, and I suspect somewhere maybe even United Future, the final draft of the law will, I think, get rid of 0-hour contracts for most workers in New Zealand.
Why do you think there was so much support politically for this? Because everyone came to the party pretty much except National. Why was that?
Yes. There was, well, everyone came to the party in the course of the campaign last year. So we named the unnamed. So we said that what we had were 0-hour contracts. It was a term we'd heard from the UK to refer to a particular contract there. And it took a little bit of convincing for the media here to see it. But they did see it, and when the companies denied they had these 0-hour contracts, we showed able to show the media, here it is, it says we do not guarantee any hours of work, and so the companies were on the back foot from the beginning. But the important thing was, I think, was that once we had named it, everybody recognised it. Every family virtually in New Zealand, I mean, from the top to the bottom, had somebody in their family on one of these things. Because I think they'd just become a standard employment tool. We had we had major chains. I remember reading one for a major chain, won't name it now, it just said, you will be available 24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
And do you think it was? And do you think it was because people could put themselves in that place and go, shit, how would I behave? How would I be able to handle not knowing what I'm working next week?
It's that issue, and even more important, I think, is so you've got the insecurity and the irregularity, but you've got the virtual elimination of rights, because how do you stand up for yourselves if the manager has the power to cut your hours the next week? And we had this problem all the time, trying to encourage our members to stand up, and they would just say, look, I'm going to lose hours.
Is there any fear that Labour was given this win by National in return for support for the spy power legislation they're needing to pass later on this year? Is there any fear? Be honest, Mike.
I hope they don't support that spy legislation. If they do, it'll be letting down the people of this country if they do.
We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Sid, what is driving more unions to start looking at industrial action? What is it? Why do we see this sudden spike?
Well, what Mike's talked about, one. The other one is the fact that we're working in some supermarkets down in South Island where there's been people in those supermarkets that have been there for 20 odd years and are just on the minimum rate. Now, the owner of that supermarket down there has said that he's not paying them, at least he's paying them the minimum rate. But up in north here, the workers doing the same work, paying and the people paying the same prices for the goods, they get paid $2 more.
Yep.
$2 more. Now he's come back and says, well, we don't do that. We look after our workers, and that's not the only thing. A lot of those, particularly those, pack and saves.
Yeah.
They've also been bullying their workers out of joining the union or being in the union.
Yep.
And I'm pretty sure that that's pretty rampant in all industries.
So you would suggest that it's a backlash by unions at having been pushed around for a long time, and also in some cases the workers just don't have any dignity in the work that they're employed to do they?
Yeah, no, they don't, and it's because of all those issues that I've just mentioned.
If the minimum wage is set at $15.25, while the living wage is set at $19.80, how are low wage workers who are predominantly brown, predominantly female, don't have a hell of a lot of voice? How are they supposed to live? How are those workers actually supposed to live?
Well, a lot of those companies or people that they work for, they're the ones that are putting a lid on all of those people. Yep. They're the ones that keeping them down there now. I think that a lot of the rallies that we've had, including Trans-Pacific Partnership rallies, have lifted a lot of these people up to see that, hey, we can do something about our working conditions here.
Right.
And I think that has had a bit of a flow where, you get supermarket workers, whereas even in the past, they weren't that militant.
Sure.
And now, you got these supermarket workers, going, even though it's for half a day, but they're out on the picket line, outside of their workplace where they work.
So the actual conditions have pushed workers to become a lot more militant than the unions driving it?
Yes, I agree. Yep.
Erin, how has New Zealand, the country where women fought to gain the vote first, ended up having to take legal action, the way Christine Bartlett has had to force the issue of equal pay?
Yeah, I think this is another example of the unions gaining wins recently through the legal system, where we would traditionally get wins through bargaining. As our collective numbers have kind of shrunk, we've attempted to use the courts in quite creative ways. And I think that case taken by the Service and Food Workers Union, now E2, was just absolutely brilliant, because what it came out with was a decision that the Equal Pay Act actually means something, and that women should be paid work the same as men for work of equal value.
Yeah.
So I think the Act kind of came around at a time where we all worked under awards, so we had a lot more worker protection. If you were an accountant, you were covered by particular terms and conditions.
Sure.
Now we kind of work in environments where everybody's in these kind of segmented small employment situations. So it was really difficult to give that Act any meaning in that context. So what that Court of Appeal decision did is it said, look, it's about the value of the work rather than who the employer is.
Yep.
And so it's been absolutely tremendous. But the fact that it's, my union's had equal pay as one of its goals for 112 years. And the all-male executive over 100 years ago decided that equal pay would be an issue for us, and we've been fighting ever since. I mean, with some success. We got the public sector got the first Equal Pay Act, 12 years before the 72 Act. So we've had some gains, but we've just never managed to realise it. And I mean, I don't think it's due to the weakness of unions. I think there's been a lot of not much political will actually to turn into a reality.
So with women treated as second-class citizens, is this patriarchy or is this just economics?
It's a bit of both actually. There's an element of discrimination in it, but there's also this cold hard fact that if you think you can pay somebody less, if a capitalist thinks they can pay somebody less, then they will.
Right.
You know, because that's how they're going to make savings, or that's how they're going to return more profit to their shareholders. Or,
Yep.
And so there's all sorts of stuff that says, you know, when women aren't collectivised and can't bargain hard, that they're going to be offered less and take less. I also think that part of that discrimination factor is this really weird an old-fashioned view that women's pay was kind of supplementing a family's income.
Right, rather
and
than...
we know that, you know,
Right.
most of two-thirds of our membership, the women are making more than their male partners, you know, or and their wage is very, very important. I actually think if we want to do something serious about child poverty in this country, we should be dealing with women's pay.
Amen. Mike, how will the TPPA impact unions, and why has there been so much resistance to it from unions?
The TPPA is a trade agreement. It's not even a trade agreement. It's an agreement between business people of the world to ease their right to do business and exploit labour and the environment. So it's a system to remove rules for them and impose rules and costs on others. So even on the level of trade, it will lead to increased costs rather than decreased costs in areas like pharmaceuticals and copyrights and so on. And that's just a license to print money for a particular group of business owners in the world. So this is nothing about trade. This is all about a protection racket by big business. So it was negotiated by, all of the negotiating teams were headed by private companies, private banks, private and it was their private interests that were being pursued. And so the labour movement in every country that the TPPA was being negotiated, the labour movement in each of those countries had a unanimous opinion. We don't want this. We don't want to strengthen the hand of those who are going to use that new power and wealth to try to disarm us and reduce our protections. It also is a threat in all sorts of public sector areas, but probably better in terms of allowing private enterprise to undermine public provision of goods and services, and I think that it's a threat to Maori in terms of their rights, which is why there was such a strong participation of Maori in those protests. So it suited this government because it's a big business government and wants to write rules to suit big business, but it is not interest of the big majority of the people of New Zealand. And when they try to claim that it is, it's just simply a lie.
It's certainly made an impact in the American election, hasn't it? Bernie Sanders winning the Rust Belt today, took Michigan off of Hillary. Is Clinton going to have real problems if she tries to progress the TPPA?
Absolutely. In fact, she's hedging her bets on it already, right? As Secretary of State and as part of the Obama presidency, she was pushing these types of trade agreements, and you often get that with the Democratic Party, where they say one thing when they're out of office and another thing when they're in office. Certainly when it comes to trade and matters like that. But what's happened in the United States, in my view, is that there has been such a radical disconnect between. And I think we see this in New Zealand, but in the United States, in a special way, a radical disconnect between the rampant accumulation of wealth by a very tiny minority and very large sectors of the US population simply marginalised and put into poverty and alienated from that system. And so both Trump and Sanders are appealing to some of that alienation, and I think this presidential election is much more interesting because I think that sort of several decade-long extreme right-wing neoliberal program carried out by both the Democrat and the Republican parties when they were in office. It was done by the Clinton presidencies, done by the Obama presidency, just like the Bush presidencies, leaving aside the foreign policy. Same domestic policy of neoliberalism, free the banks, free the markets, cut welfare for the poor and all the rest of it. That is going to face a real challenge, in this election, and the next president will not be able to carry on business in the same way.
Erin, there's been a long history of intelligence agencies spying on unionists. Keith Locke has been under surveillance since he was 8 years old. I'm not quite sure why we needed to spy on him since he was 8 years old. How do we know these new spying laws that National are trying to push through won't be used against unionists?
Look, we don't, and I think that the reason they want to spy on unions is because unions are a threat to established power. So what unions essentially do in a society is they rebalance power and they redistribute wealth, which is why, as unions have declined, inequality in our country has grown wider and wider. And I think any time we start to show our strength and, and start to make headway, we're going to have an attack from the other side, from the people who hold power and don't want to give it up or share it. And that's going to happen using whatever levers they can and passing legislation that they can use to, intimidate us or whatever. Is no doubt one of the tools that they have.
Will the CTU and the PSA, will they be looking at putting in recommendations to how the GCSB or the SIS would interpret economic welfare before they're able to trigger their spying?
It's not something that we've looked at yet, so have me on another show in future and we'll look at it. But I want to give you a bit of an interesting fact about the GCSB actually, because they're members of ours, of course, government department, and they've actually done some very progressive things internally for the members who work there, which is kind of it feels a bit weird, but. It was one of the first agencies, for example, to give 10 days domestic violence leave in their collective agreement for people who work there who might need to take leave to deal with that kind of situation at home. So
it's good to know that there are some progressive movements.
It's our members who draft these laws and who and work in these agencies as well. So,
Sid, if we look at the brutal way in which Tallies and AFCO treated their predominantly Maori workforce when they used hunger as a negotiating tactic back in 2012, the weakest workers are the ones treated worst. How does the union movement reach out to those workers and bring them into the fold?
Well, I think we've got to do it on a community basis. And we've got this thing going on about iwi relationships. So we've been trying to get them involved. And because they produce food too, and they send a lot of that to a lot of their plants. That's including all the other food plants they've got, like fish and veggies and all that. So we've been trying to put pressure on from that perspective by telling them not to supply them with produce. Because of particularly in out in those regions there. There was about 80% of the people working in those plants are Maori.
Right.
And they've got to come. Somebody's got to, in the community, and the communities in Wairoa and Te Puke have been really good. They've stepped up. They've been really good to communities in going out and supporting those workers.
Right.
But this company the Tallies company and the group of companies are a serial offender on all sorts of levels. They kill and maim workers on a regular basis. ACC covers with tens of millions of dollars in payments for the people that they kill and maim, and they also have driven unions out of nearly every plant that they've owned, and as a consequence of that, they've been able to undermine the health and safety and protections of the workforce. And they don't care what fines are imposed on them by the courts. They do not care.
And he gets a knighthood. And he gets a knighthood. How many workers have you injured? Here's your knighthood.
We need to keep naming this company as a murderer and maimer of its workforce, and we need to encourage New Zealanders to turn their backs on buying their products.
Sid, speaking with new migrant workers last week, I heard many cases of migrant workers having their passports and identifications cards held by the employer while they were paid in cash far below the minimum wage. And they don't seem to get any real employment conditions whatsoever. What are the unions doing right now to reach out to the migrant workers community in New Zealand?
Well, we've got that organisation called Migrante and Dennis Maga, one of our senior organisers is organising that. We have different spokespeople in different areas. But you know, the thing that really upsets me about all this is that the people that are ripping them off are basically just about their own people that are doing it. And you know,
is it an education campaign to explain what a responsible employer should be?
No.
no,
I'll tell you
Do you
what.
think is it greed? What is it?
it's greed.
It's greed.
It's greed.
It's a thing that the capitalists will pay whatever they have to get it to pay. There is a rate in the Dominion Road Chinese food businesses. There's a rate for the job which is between $8 and $10 an hour, or it's $100 a day for beginning a 10-hour day, $100 a day. And all the young people are getting that, and they can't get any more. The labour inspector simply needs to go door to door on that street, or on Sandringham Road, or in some other areres, and they would pick up literally hundreds of violations.
So why isn't it happening? Why is the labour?
They choose not to do so. So they choose not to do so. Now they did get one of these ethnic restaurants exploiting some of their own staff, and the Masala restaurant chain.
That's right.
And the police have seized their properties, which is also very new. Because what these companies would do is we would take cases against them, and they just wind themselves up.
Sure,
right?
sure,
There's nothing you can do. We had one with the Masala restaurant group. The woman had been sexually assaulted on the job. She had to quit. We did a constructive dismissal case, and they wound it up, and we couldn't deal with them. And so I was so pleased to see them named. And the labour inspector did follow through with that, but they were also cheating on their IRD, they were cheating on all sorts, and the police have now seized all $34 million worth of their property as proceeds of crime. And that's fantastic. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. And a fantastic example for all small businesses, or whatever, even big business, because it's interesting how much money they were able to accumulate in this process. How much
Erin, the spirit level is very clear that the best way to erode inequality is stronger unions. What do unions need to gain more teeth in New Zealand?
Okay, there's a range of legislative changes that I'm sure could be made to make it easier for us to operate. I mean, for starters, employers anyone who starts in the workforce should be told which union can cover them, and their details should be provided to a union. And then we can go and contact them. But we also, have really restricted right to strike in this country, which means there are very few situations where we can actually show our strengths, because striking and taking industrial action is part of the way that we show people that we can actually have an effect on.
I think a cat just jumped there on Erin's lap. I think that may be the first live stream cat attack we've ever had in New Zealand. If you're ready there, Erin, I'll come back to you. Is part of the problem here that National is ignoring empirical evidence and basing policy on pure ideology? Underperforming charter schools that still get paid a bonus, and private prisons that run fight clubs only make sense if you hate unions.
I think that it's more difficult for unions to organise in areas where we've never been before. We call it greenfields recruitment, and it's one of the most difficult things for us to do. So where we see strong unions still existing are in those areas where nursing, teaching, where unions have been around for a long time. So when things start to get privatised and splintered off, there's no kind of unions basis to start with. You're starting right from the beginning. And so I think that's part of, that deliberate strategy. Part of their privatisation strategy is around knowing that they'll always be one step ahead of us. And so we've got a real big challenge there. And it is ideologically driven. I mean, if you look at the outcomes of a state-run prison versus the Serco-run prisons, why would you, if you were looking at the evidence of what the health and safety of those workers and the well-being of and rehabilitation or reoffending rates of those prisoners, why would you go private? It's
same with the charter schools.
Mike, how will changing technology impact workers? We're hearing a lot about robots effectively taking over 70% of the jobs.
Look, to be honest, I'm a little sceptical of that line of argument. That it's been around for 150 years. It is true that there will be an acceleration in a range of jobs, and many jobs will disappear as a consequence. But it's also true that some other jobs will be created. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it's all doom and gloom in that regard. I think there are particular dangers in the sharing app technology that are associated with these things like Uber, and therefore, so it breaks down workers and turns them into self-employed contractors and so on. But there are ways within that technology to challenge it.
Right.
So you can design an Uber app that works with a cooperative employment agency rather than private. Private things. Or
so you can adapt it. You can
have an algorithm that guarantees the legal minimum wage for workers as well. And you can pass laws to make sure that happens, and you can allow them to organise collectively, like Seattle is doing.
Sid, how do we make unions more relevant to a younger generation, some of whom may never have heard of a union before?
Well, I mean, we've got to, get most of my family.
Yep.
My grandkids and my kids all know about unions.
Yep.
And that probably starts at in the house itself.
Yep.
But and I know that as a subject at any of the schools that I went to when I was a young fella, and the schools now, there's nothing in the curriculum about
the social progress of New Zealand and how unions played a part, right?
And how we had the 40-hour week. How we had collective agreements, or in the old days was the old award system. But there's nothing about that. Nothing about the history of what happened here. Nothing whatsoever.
Erin, many users of public services are incredibly angry and disappointed by policies that seem focused more on disqualifying them from welfare than actually assisting them. Does underfunding a public service make the argument to privatise them much easier to sell to the voting public than fully funding the public service?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the starve the beast strategy, isn't it? So you underfund a public service to the point that it's filled with holes and doesn't deliver what you expect it to for citizens. Everybody gets angry at it, and the workers within it. The ministers point fingers at it and point to the CEs and blame everybody else, and then they say, oh well, look, there's a real convenient answer. We've got this sparkly new company who can come in and we'll privatise it and it will work better. And in the case of charter schools, I mean, what they did was that first lot of charter schools, to really make it succeed, pumped a huge amount of money into them so that they couldn't fail, so they could then say, this rundown school up here in Northland, we'll send your kids over to the shiny new one. And it's just completely unfair, because that public school would have been absolutely fine had it been funded.
Sure. Thank you, panel. I'd like to get a final word from each of the panellists. What do workers in New Zealand need right now? Mike?
They've got to organise collectively, join a union and take part in its activities and negotiate collective agreements, and you can achieve things. We've done it with Unite Union and the 0 hours issue, and other workers can do likewise.
Sid, what do New Zealand workers need right now?
Well, they need a bit of backbone and to look at the different stuff that particularly their own family are going through. They must take notice of that, and they need to rise up, I'd say. And my personal opinion, got to work right now to get rid of this government.
Erin, your final word. What do New Zealand workers need right now?
They need to join unions, and they are joining us. We're growing, and despite this government, and we'll continue to grow, and we have to keep the pressure on over equal pay, over ending 0 hours, over improving workers' rights, and you can only do that by working together.
Thank you, panellists. And my final word, let's be honest, as to why the government bent over backwards to the farming lobby to water down and weaken the health and safety laws last year. The reason National are putting workers' lives in danger and made a mockery of the law by putting worm farming and butterfly breeding in high risk while leaving dairy, lamb and beef in low risk is because the government feared giving unions a platform to possibly recruit from. That's how ideological this government really are. While pundits on other mainstream media panel shows tell us that this government are moderate, the reality is that this government would prefer to have workers die on the job than possibly give unions more power. Unions are not the enemy, they are the solution to ensuring work with dignity and encountering the hegemonic structures of society that lock the democratic majority out of capitalism. In 2016, no one should have to die from their job. Thank you, panellists, and thank you, whānau, for watching us on watianews.com, thedailyblog.nz, and Face TV Sky Channel 83. We'll join you again 7 p.m. tomorrow night for Wātea Fifth Estate. Kia ora.